Reuters described it plainly this week. The US-Israel war on Iran, now 5 months old, is expanding beyond its main fronts to pull in more countries by the week. On Wednesday alone, the US carried out fresh strikes inside Iran. A drone reportedly hit a US-owned gas storage tanker at an Egyptian port on the Mediterranean. And American and Saudi forces struck Iran-aligned groups inside Iraq for the first time, with Riyadh publicly involved. That strike killed at least 20 members of Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces, PMF, the Iran-backed paramilitary network that's technically folded into Iraq's own security structure. Reuters reported that Iraqi men shouted "Death to America" as they carried the bodies of the dead through the streets. Iraq's presidency called the strikes a flagrant violation of the country's sovereignty, while its prime minister in office, barely 2 months, urged all sides to keep Iraq out of a war it didn't start. Reuters called it a dangerous rift, and that's not an exaggeration. Iraq is one of the only governments in the world trying to maintain close military and diplomatic ties with both Washington and Tehran at once. And that balancing act is now being tested from both directions in the same week. Add Ukraine's foreign minister warning Iran over a Caspian Sea strike, and Yemen's Houthis blockading Saudi Arabia, and you have a conflict that now touches the Mediterranean, the Caspian, the Red Sea, and the streets of Baghdad all at the same time. And underneath all of this sits a quieter but arguably more consequential fracture. Gulf security analyst Andreas Craig and Cinzia Bianco have both pointed to how this war has widened the gap between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Once close partners, now competing for influence from Yemen and Socotra to Sudan and Somaliland. Riyadh had largely backed recognized governments in these places. Abu Dhabi, according to Craig, has built out what he calls an axis of successionists, a network of non-state and breakaway actors stretching across the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa. Here is what makes this moment different from earlier stages of this war. For months, escalation meant more strikes on Iran, or Iran hitting back at US bases. What we're watching now is escalation by proxy and by geography, a war that spread sideways into places that were never supposed to be combatants. Iraq didn't choose this fight. Egypt didn't choose it either. But both are now absorbing its consequences. And Baghdad, in particular, is being asked to do something close to impossible: hold together a government that owes loyalty to two capitals that are actively bombing each other's proxies inside its own borders. That's the kind of pressure that doesn't just strain a government, it can break one. A prime minister 2 months into the job urging restraint from a security structure he doesn't fully control is not a position anyone would call stable. If the Popular Mobilization Forces or the wider Islamic resistance in Iraq decide the government can't protect them from strikes like this one, the question stops being about Iran's war with Washington and becomes a question about whether Iraq itself holds together. And then there is Gulf's own quiet unraveling. It's tempting to treat Saudi-UAE rivalry as a separate story from the Iran war, but it isn't. This war has forced every regional power to pick a strategy for a world where American security guarantees look less permanent than they used to. Saudi Arabia is choosing coalitions and recognized governments. The UAE is choosing proxies and breakaway footholds. Neither approach is inherently reckless, but pursued at the same time, in the same waters, they put two of the most powerful Gulf states on a collision course with each other. On top of a war they are already both entangled in. Whether that ends in healthier, more independent posturing from Gulf states or in outright chaos probably depend on whether Riyadh and Abu Dhabi can find a floor under their rivalry before the wider war forces their hand. We have Dr. Jeffrey Miller with us from New Zealand, who is a geopolitical and strategic analyst, editor of Gulf States Insights. Thank you so much, Dr. Jeffrey, for joining. Reuters is calling this war a widening war where the edges are now blurring, with Egypt and Iraq being directly affected. In your opinion, does Iraq's situation caught between Riyadh and Tehran, with its own militias being bombed? What does this represent? Is this a breaking point, with the 30th September date approaching when the US would be leaving formally Iraq? How are you looking at it?
Indeed, I think history will record this was the week that the war in the Middle East broadened again, both with what we saw in Jordan this week when Iran launched an attack against US bases there, which was not a retaliatory response to US attacks. That's why that was significant. The drone strike in Egypt, we still don't know exactly what happened there. And then everything that is going on with Saudi Arabia, and you mentioned there Saudi Arabia and the United States jointly struck Popular Mobilization Forces sites in Iraq because Iraq and those militia, really, to be specific, have been attacking Saudi Arabia, attacking Saudi oil facilities. Now, for your viewers, the important factor here is to remember is geography, because Iraq is simply much closer to Saudi Arabia's eastern province, where much of the oil facilities are located, much closer than the Houthis in Yemen, who have been undertaking strikes more in the western side of Saudi Arabia. Think Yanbu, for example, the port on the Red Sea, where Saudi Arabia has been piping a lot of its oil from those eastern provinces and then getting it out through the Bab el-Mandab. And the Houthis have launched a blockade on Saudi shipping there. But the Popular Mobilization Forces militia in Iraq have been firing at Saudi oil facilities. We still don't know in detail what has happened, because Saudi Arabia has put a bit of a cloak of secrecy as to exactly what damage has been caused. But it was enough to see Saudi Arabia and the United States make that joint response by by undertaking those military strikes against the militia in Iraq. It is really significant. That hasn't happened before. It didn't happen back in 2019 when the militia undertook a similar strike, a very big strike against a Saudi oil facility in Eastern Province. It is really significant that Saudi Arabia has entered the fray here, and increasingly Saudi Arabia is fighting effectively a three-front war with the Houthis in the south, the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces militia, which are linked to Iran, and then, of course, with Iran itself. So
Can we
Saudi Arabia
centralize
has
this
tried
threat?
to stay out of,
Is
yeah.
there a core to this threat? Would you call it Iran-centric threat, or is it something that we are still watching and learning about?
Look, I think there are so many uncertainties here in this war and exactly what is going on, particularly Saudi Arabia. It's been right from the beginning of the war. It hasn't always been clear exactly what has been going on in Saudi Arabia in terms of the nature of the strikes that it suffered directly from Iran, how severe they were, what damage was caused, and I think that's been the same this week as well. We're still not sure, but I think the fact that Saudi Arabia felt pushed to strike those Popular Mobilization Forces militia in Iraq directly, this military strike, to become more involved in the war when it had actually been trying to stay out of it, compared with some of the other smaller Gulf states. I think it does actually indicate that the damage in Saudi Arabia is quite significant, and that the Houthis have done real damage to Saudi facilities and infrastructure, and so have these Iraqi militia. And that's a real threat to Saudi Arabia because of the threat to the oil facilities. And it is really troubling, just over the past couple of weeks, how the Bab el-Mandab and the Red Sea have really been drawn into this conflict.
Even the Caspian
Suddenly
Sea.
you've got Indeed, look, the Caspian Sea as well, with the strike by Ukraine on the Iranian tanker, and there was a report out just in the last couple of days that suggested that we came within perhaps hours of a reciprocal strike by Iran against Ukrainian port, which is quite extraordinary
It
that
is.
we could have ended up with a joined up war here with Iran and Ukraine all together. And I guess this is really what it's all about. I feel that this war is it's becoming more and more complex.
It is.
We started off with that limited war between just Iran and the Gulf states. That was bad enough. And then uh, some extra ramifications for the likes of Jordan. But suddenly it feels like the whole Middle East is really being drawn into it, especially with the likes of Egypt coming into this picture, also the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb, and then as you mentioned, the Caspian Sea and Ukraine,
And
and
that
increasingly so.
gentleman, I'm
So
forgetting the name, who has just been sanctioned by US, that he was the financier of Ali Mustafa Khamenei and other elites in the Iranian government. He was also operating from Dubai, if I'm not wrong. Ali
correct. I mean,
Ansari.
there are many. Yeah, indeed. I mean, look, there are many Iranian business people who have used Dubai as a base, and I think, I mean, there are other examples in the Gulf, like Oman, like Qatar, who have recognized this, that they have to deal with Iran because of their shared interest. I mean, Qatar's got the shared natural gas field, Oman, of course, and Iran have been working together and trying to find a diplomatic solution to the Strait of Hormuz, given that they are the two states really on either side of the Strait of Hormuz. But going back to your original point, I mean, it is interesting that Saudi Arabia and Iran, you might have thought that they would be the ones to engage in this diplomacy. I still think there's a possibility that is happening. Where it all becomes more complicated is that the Saudis are dealing with the Houthis and are dealing with the issues in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb. And that's something that those smaller Gulf states on the other side, on the Gulf side, and not having to deal with in the same way. So it's a more complicated picture perhaps for Saudi Arabia. But I think all of the states are grappling fundamentally with the same problem, that this war has just created havoc, created enormous instability, and it is having an incredibly detrimental impact on not just oil and gas exports, but on the commercial viability of these states. And the fact is that no one in the world really wants to go to the Gulf at the moment. And
Yeah.
that's a real problem when these states are trying to transition away from oil, showing that they're a safe place to do business.
Yeah.
So
I
I think
was
they all
talking
have a
to a
vested
couple of
interest in wrapping up this conflict and as soon as possible.
Yeah, I was talking to a couple of consultants for the Vision 2030, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that they have, and the new city that they are building. And they said that there are a lot of apprehensions in the investors around that, whether that would continue or not. So yes, they are taking a big hit. But at the same time, if we stay on Saudi Arabia, who is trying to build an international coalition to protect shipping in the Red Sea, because of course, first they were attacked in the Hormuz, now it's the Red Sea. So I think their options are thinning and waning. Do you see a coalition coming together to resolve this Red Sea issue?
Yeah, I saw that report, and I guess that the big question is whether the United States will really provide its backing to that coalition if it comes to pass, because you'll need US military support for this to really work. Otherwise, it becomes just more of a symbolic effort. I mean, we saw similar discussions back in April and May when it came to the Strait of Hormuz and the idea of an international coalition operating there to patrol the strait. I mean, it's an interesting idea, but I think ultimately the way forward in this war has to be diplomacy. And I think going
Sure.
back to what we talked about with the UAE, I think they recognize that there has to be a diplomatic solution. And I think for the United States, in the end, the only option with this war is diplomacy. The other options are quite unpalatable. In other words, sending US ground troops into Iran to try and bring about full regime change, or complete capitulation and allowing Iran to gain control of the Strait of Hormuz and allowing the Houthis to run across Saudi Arabia. Look, the only option I think for all sides, when we really step back and look at what's happening, the only option is diplomacy, and it's just going to take a while to get there. We're in this sort of holding pattern. We're not quite back in full-scale war, but we're certainly not at peace, and we're not even going in the right direction at the moment. And as I've said before on your show, the quick guide to this war is simply the oil price, and it is sitting at the moment around $90, which shows that there is just an elevated risk. There is escalation in this war, not de-escalation. It was $70 a barrel just a couple of weeks ago. So things are getting worse, not better, sadly.
And there are a lot of reports considering, is there a military solution to this choke points problem, and everybody comes down to the same conclusion that there is none. It's not possible. So your point is valid. The only solution is negotiation and sitting together and finding a solution around it. Dr. Jeffrey Miller, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure having you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on your show.
So Iran's president told his country to stand firm, and hours later, a family on Qashm Island paid the price for a war that keeps finding new ways to escalate, even as both sides insist they still want diplomacy. Saudi Arabia is now building the kind of international coalition it spent 5 months trying to avoid needing, while Iran turns down help from the one neighbor that's tried hardest to bridge it back to the table. And across Iraq, Egypt, and the wider Gulf, a war that began between Washington and Tehran is now reshaping alliances that have nothing directly to do with either of them. Every actor in this conflict said it didn't want to become a combatant. Every actor has been proven wrong by circumstances or by the choices of people who also said they didn't want escalation. At some point, saying something is not your war stops actually keeping it away from you or becoming yours. I'm Zunaira Azhar, and this was Decode. Good night.